If you've played Baldur's Gate 3 and have a 3D printer or an active tabletop game, I'm sure the thought has crossed your mind of how cool it would be to print out your custom character or party members as miniatures. But is that even possible? If you want to skip to the tutorial, you can go to this section in the video. And if you're only interested in seeing the results, feel free to skip to the end. But for context, here's a quick story on why this is such an elusive thing to do. For the past 2 months, I've scoured every corner of the internet. Google, Reddit, Steam forums, modding Discord groups. Hell, I reached out to people who have been asking this question since the early release of the game in 2021. And no matter where I looked, I stumbled into dead end after dead end. No one had an answer. The question remained. By the light of Saloon, we have a lead! After I'd already given up, I stumbled across this listing on Cults, a 3D model and print website. A Russian user by the name of Deltervik had done the impossible. He created and uploaded beautiful models of all the origin characters to his page. So if you're just looking to print origin characters from Baldur's Gate 3, your quest ends here. You can head over to Deltervik's page and get those downloaded on his portal. But I wanted more. I was still hungry for knowledge because I wanted to 3D print my custom Tav from Baldur's Gate 3, and eventually share that knowledge with the community. So I reached out to Deltervik, asking how any of this was even possible. And day after day, my inbox was empty. At this point, I was helpless, so I did the unthinkable. I double emailed him. And the next day, we got this. Finally, an answer. Albeit it's from a Russian article about Elder Scrolls Online, but there it was. A goldmine of knowledge, just hidden behind characters in Russian that I didn't understand. So like any developed primate would, I took it to Google Translate. And Google Translate, you know, it did its best. What I took away from this article is that this was possible, but there was going to be a big learning curve to make it happen. At first, I was discouraged by how hard this was going to be, but I decided we were too close to the finish line. So in a last-ditch effort, I asked Deltervik if he could hop on Discord with me and just show me how it's done. And to my surprise, he actually said yes, because he was modeling Shadowheart soon, and he invited me to watch that process on Discord. Although there was a pretty serious language barrier, and I had to wake up before the sun came out, I got everything I was looking for. I want to give a huge shout out to Deltervik, because without his knowledge and willingness to share it, this video wouldn't be possible. You can find the link to Deltervik's Cults profile in the description of this video, and support him by downloading his 3D models of the origin characters from Baldur's Gate 3. Now, without further ado, here is a step-by-step guide in English on how to 3D print your characters from Baldur's Gate 3. Here's the programs we're going to need today. Ninja Ripper, Blender, Zbrush, or Nomad Sculpt, which is a way cheaper alternative on iOS and Android devices, and Chitubox. If you were like me and had zero knowledge of any of these programs, I want to assure you that you can still watch this video and understand how to 3D print your character and other characters from Baldur's Gate 3. I was in your shoes. I know what kind of knowledge I needed when I was starting this process. So with Deltervik's help and a lot of hours on YouTube learning how to use Blender and Zbrush, I've got everything in a package for you right here. So we're going to keep it simple and go step by step. If you have any challenges during this process, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try to help you. The first application we're going to need to download is Ninja Ripper. The link to their Patreon is in my description. In this tutorial, we use Ninja Ripper to take our 3D models from an active session of Baldur's Gate 3. When Ninja Ripper is loaded, navigate to the executable program line, click the 3 dots on the rightmost corner, and you're going to want to locate your Baldur's Gate 3.exe file. When you put in this exe file, it should also update your working directory for you to be the Baldur's Gate 3 bin. Navigate to Settings and Output Directory if you want to change where your files go. With this information ready to go, hit the Launch button on Ninja Ripper. This will open up an instance of your game with the Ninja Ripper tool in the top left corner. Don't worry, this isn't going to mess with your save files at all. Once you're in-game, load the save file that you wish to extract the character models from. Something that I found helpful before doing a model extraction is to take your characters to a small sub-area in the game. I like the Tiefling hideout in the refugee camp near the Emerald Grove, Don't judge me, this is my Dark Urge playthrough, that is why there are bodies littered on the ground. But anything will work, even the Mind Flayer ship you start the game on. In order to get the most detailed 3D model from this extraction, you're going to want to go into tactical view by pressing O on your keyboard, zooming the camera all the way in, and then as an added bonus for my character's pose, I like to press the control key on my keyboard because it puts them into a sort of battle stance. Ninja Ripper is going to extract the 3D models of your characters as you see them on screen, so if you want them to be in a certain pose for your 3D print, take that into account before initiating the extraction. Once you have all that set up, you can press the print screen or insert button on your keyboard to start the extraction. Give it some time and the Ninja Ripper icon on the top left of the screen will turn red, and once it turns green again, your extraction is complete and you can locate your files. We're done using Ninja Ripper now. For the next step, we're going to open Blender. The very first thing we have to do in Blender is navigate to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then make sure the Ninja Ripper add-on is checked. After we do this, we're going to start importing models from the scene we captured in Ninja Ripper into Blender. Since Ninja Ripper took the 3D models of everything in the scene, we're going to have to navigate through the files to find where the 3D models we want to use are. Next, we're going to go to File, Import, Ninja Ripper World Space, and then select the folder that your Ninja Ripper output files went to. This folder should contain folders that look like these, and you can navigate to the most recent one, select the Frame 0 folder, and you'll know you're in the right place when you see a giant list of a whole bunch of different mesh files titled by numbers. Some combination of these mesh files is going to make our 3D model. If you have a strong enough computer, you can import all these meshes into Blender at one time, but I recommend doing about 70 files at a time. You can select multiple files by holding down Shift and clicking. For example, I click Mesh 200, scroll all the way down to Mesh 270 while holding the Shift button and click 270. Now before we click that Import Ninja Ripper 2 button, it's important to change some of the settings on the right hand side of this panel. Navigate to Geometry, select Reprojection Full, and under Width and Height, go ahead and put in 1920 by 1080. This is the scale in which you play the game at, the pixel count. And then in FOVY, you're going to want to change that to 30. This kind of just ensures that everything is to scale when you import it into Blender. With that resolved, we can go ahead and click the blue Import Ninja Ripper 2 button. Give it a second and those 3D models from the scene will load into Blender. Don't worry, they're going to be upside down. We'll fix that in a second. And there we go. Selecting that kind of range of 200 to 270 landed us all the pieces we need from our character we'll be modeling today. If you notice that some parts of your character, like their boots, their hair, or their weapon, aren't in the scene, that just likely means that you missed it when we were selecting the meshes earlier. So go back and try importing a different selection or range of files. That's why when we were making the rip, I like to bring the characters into a smaller environment, so we have less of a selection of meshes to pick from when we're trying to find all the files we need to assemble our character model. Each scene will look a little different depending on how many NPCs are in the area, how many characters you have, and what region you're in. But a good rule of thumb is that party members usually have a box around them. So if you can't find your character, you're going to want to find those boxes and delete them, and the characters might just be hiding underneath. Once you found your character and it looks like they're not missing any pieces, you're going to want to start deleting everything around them. You can do this by making sure you're on the selection tool and clicking and dragging to select the pieces of the environment you want to delete by pressing the delete key on your keyboard. Once you isolate your character, you're going to want to click and drag and make sure everything on their model is selected. Once you have that selection, you're going to want to copy that selection by clicking Ctrl and C. After copying that selection, we're going to go to File, New, and General. Delete the items from the scene and press Ctrl V. We do this just to make sure there aren't any leftover artifacts from our previous import. You'll notice that our 3D model is upside down and offset from the center of the canvas right now. First, we're going to make sure all parts of our model are selected, and then we're going to press Shift and S. This will open up a command wheel, and from here, we're going to want to select to Cursor. This will move our 3D model to the middle of the workspace. And very quickly, we can navigate to the rotation tool and select the red axis to turn our model upright. And congratulations, we've done the first step in getting our 3D model. It is not a walk in the park getting here, so good job. Now, it needs some adjustments before it will be functional as a 3D print, but that's what I'm going to teach you how to do next. This is a courtesy reminder to save by going to File and selecting Save, because this program is not that reliable and will crash on you, especially with some of the stuff we're going to do later. So, I mentioned that this wasn't ready to be 3D printed. There are parts of this 3D model that are just too thin, like his cape, or too complex, like his hair. Hair is kind of its own issue with this process, so I'm going to be going over that at the very end. So, when you try to 3D print them, especially as something as delicate as a miniature, your printer wouldn't know what to do and it would come out a mess. So the next step is to thicken those unprintable variables, as well as thicken any details we might think will get lost because they're too small on the print. But before we do that, we have to format our 3D model for editing. This next step is super important and we have to do it before we edit any other part of the model. So while we're in object mode, we're going to want to select our entire model again by pressing A, right click it, shade flat. Navigate to edit mode, select this middle option, go to faces, and select trios to quads. This is going to make it a lot easier for us to edit the parts of the model we want to make thicker. This is also very important. We want to make sure we have the auto merge box checked. I think it's an important time in the video to share with you my tips on managing the camera in Blender, because knowing these tricks can save you a lot of time. So here's a small crash course on that. The first thing you want to do is press in, navigate to view, and select to 3D cursor. What that's going to do is it's going to orbit the camera around this like little red circle, which means that you can shift and right click anywhere you want, and now you'll be orbiting that item. You can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. If you click down on the mouse wheel, you can orbit around. And now we can change to, let's say we want to edit the shield. Now we're on that, we can zoom to it and move around like that on it. Say we want to get maybe a different angle, that's when we're going to move our cursor to this little like hand tool, and we can drag to kind of get a different angle on it. Use our cursor to zoom around it like that. This is really helpful for when we're editing specific items on the character. Okay, now we know how to navigate the camera. Now we're going to move on to thickening the thin parts of our model. Okay, this is the most complex part of the process, but I'm going to try to break it down step by step so it's digestible. Step 1, identifying what needs to be thickened. Step 2, selecting the item. Step 3, isolating the item from the rest of the model. Step 4, deleting unnecessary edges. And step 5, extruding. Okay, step 1, identifying what needs to be thickened. There are thousands of different armor combinations in Baldur's Gate 3, which is really exciting for a project like this, but it also means that each character is going to have different things that they need thickened. A good rule of thumb is we want to target things that kind of look like sheets of paper, are disconnected from the character's body, or are going to be too small on a miniature to identify. Some examples of this are most weapons, loose fabrics not attached to the character, appendages on items like boots and gloves, and fine details like beads on a necklace. Now that we know what to look for, let's edit something. These boot accents are a perfect example of something we're going to need to touch up. They're small, thin, and don't protrude from the boot enough to stand out when printing a mini. This brings us to step 2. The first thing we want to do is left click one of the lines on the item. Next, we're going to want to hover over the item with our mouse and press L. This sometimes selects the whole item, but sometimes it doesn't. So you're just going to hover around the item and press L to make sure the entire item is yellow/orange. Nice, we've got our item selected. Now let's isolate it from the rest of the character model. The way we're going to do that is by pressing Ctrl and I. This is going to invert our selection. Now we press H. What that does is it hides what we're not working on. Don't worry, you didn't delete anything. If you want to activate these layers again, you press Alt and H. But now that we have our item isolated, this brings us to step 4. Step 4 is a little tricky. Think about every item like a room. We don't want our room to have any walls or a ceiling. We just want the floor. So let's take a look at the accents on this boot. See how there's a wall extending from the entire perimeter of the accent of this boot? We want to delete that in order to make it look like this. See how there's no walls extending from the edge of the shape? So to do that, we want to make sure we're on the selection tool. You can go by and select these edges one by one, holding Shift and click. But if you Alt click, it will select surrounding edges. This is a convenient tool to help you select the entirety of the edges faster, but you have to make sure that it's not selecting edges that you don't want to delete, because that happens sometimes. Once you've selected the perimeter of your shape that you want to delete, you press X on your keyboard and select verticals. What this does is it not only deletes that line that you selected, but it deletes the space around it. So if you find yourself deleting a part of your item, it's likely because one of the edges you selected wasn't just a wall, like it was connected to the actual object itself. So that's something to just look out for and avoid when you're making these selections. If you do run into one of those edges that is connected to the item, you can press X and select Delete Edge instead. Just make sure this doesn't leave you with any black lines floating in the air. If it does, just also delete them the same way. Congratulations, you just did the hardest part of this process. You're going to have to kind of rinse and repeat it a couple times, but it gets easier every time, I promise. Okay, in step 5, we're going to want to select everything by pressing A or hovering over everything and selecting it with L. And then we're going to want to press Alt-E on our keyboard. This is going to bring up the extrude menu. For items like this that are mostly flat, we're going to want to pick the extrude faces option. This allows us to stretch out our plane and make it thicker. The thickness you're looking at right now is kind of the minimum thickness we want to be doing for all of these items. Here's an additional step that's required for some of these accent pieces. Select your item and press G. This allows you to drag your item around the space. Remember, you can unhide the rest of your model by pressing Alt and H. So that way you can place it further out from your model. This way, details like this actually stand out on a miniature rather than blending into the boot. So that's the basic process for making these thinner objects on our character thicker. So that was a shape with thinner walls that were easily identifiable. But more often than not, you'll run into shapes on your character that are more complex with harder to identify walls and loop or have curvature to them, so we have to use a different method to extrude. Taking a look at this fabric piece on my character's shoulder, we can't really identify any walls on this. So that means it's ready to extrude. But since it's a curved shape, we actually have to press Alt-E and select Extrude Along Normals. This is the option you should use when extruding anything that has a curve or a loop. For successful prints, it's good practice to make sure our extruded items are connected to the limbs and body of our character, because a 3D printer really struggles to print floating things. So let's rinse and repeat that process one more time with an item that's a little more complex. So this is clothing on my character's back that's not quite attached to the body. We're going to start off by hovering our mouse over it and pressing L, then pressing Ctrl-I to invert the selection, H to hide the unnecessary things on my character, and then we can explore this item to see what we need to get rid of to extrude it. Off the bat, I noticed some walls near the armholes on this item. I alt-click the edge of one of the walls on this item, press X, and delete the verticals. Now, when I deleted the verticals, I took a look at the top and noticed that the shape was kind of destroyed. So let's undo with Ctrl-Z and investigate. So it appears that when I alt-clicked the edge, it selected the rim at the top of the item that wasn't necessarily a wall. So I shift-clicked the selection to unselect it, press X, and delete the verticals. This side looks good, so let's take a look at the other side. It looks like deleting the verticals isn't quite going to work here because of that line going through the middle of the shape on the edge. So to make sure we're not destroying the shape of the item, I'm going to go ahead and go one by one through these and delete the edges instead. Make sure to delete the little floating black lines as well. This is tedious, but if you find that deleting the verticals on the walls of your shape is destroying some of the geometry of the item, this is the best way to ensure that that doesn't happen. Alright, it looks like my item has no more walls on the edges, it's just kind of paper thin. But at the top, I do notice there's kind of a wall here, but since it's part of the main shape, instead of deleting it, what we're going to want to do is move it to be kind of flat. And the main tool we use for this is by pressing G on our keyboard to move it like we did with the boot accents earlier. I think it looks pretty good now. So we're going to click on one of the lines on our item, we're going to hover over it, press L, we're going to press Alt-E, and extrude along normals since it's a curved shape and not a flat one. And there we go. We just did a little bit more of a complex shape. So now you're equipped with the basics to go through and thicken those thinner parts on your character. You don't necessarily need to go through and thicken everything, but here's just a quick rapid fire list of the things that I thickened for this project. The cape, earrings, which you usually don't have to delete edges for, you can just select the whole thing and extrude along normals. But items like this are still so small that it's going to be the tiniest detail on your mini. So if you're not doing a bigger print, you might just want to delete some of the jewelry. Like this earring, for example, I scaled up to be kind of massive from what it was, and it still barely came out on my miniature. So I'll let you decide whether or not dealing with the jewelry is worth your time. If not, you can just select it and delete it. One thing you should always delete though is eyelashes. If you don't delete them, they can destroy the eyes on your print. I thickened this collar going around the character's neck, this sash hanging from their belt, this thin piece of fabric wrapping around the character's waist. I deleted these little dangly things because they were going to be way too small to pop up on a mini. I thickened these circular pendants, this boot fabric, this sash, most of his shirt, which was made up of entirely different parts, this thin part of the sash going over his shoulder, these pendants on the cape that kind of look like the Batman logo, this rounded piece that attaches the cape to the body, this fabric rim around the arm, his left arm, which was being kind of weird, but I'll go over my reasoning for that when we move on to the next application. This necklace, which I absolutely recommend doing because it showed up really well on the mini. The armor on the exterior of these boots. And finally, the little rings on the belt loop and the pendant on the character. Oh, that was a mouthful. Okay, you don't need to focus so much on the little items on your character if you don't care about the hyper detail on your mini. But I laid everything out for you just in case you wanted to literally make it as detailed as possible. We're done thickening. But speaking of things that are too detailed, that's where hair becomes problematic. In its current state, the hair on this 3D model has way too many polygons, and all of them are really thin shapes that make up this kind of mass of hair. But there is a way to fix this, although it works for some hairstyles better than others. Navigate to the right side of your workspace and click this blue tool icon. Select Add Modifier and pick Solidify. This is going to kind of give it a blocky shape, but it's going to be easier to work with in a second, trust me. Now we're going to add another modifier. This time, we're going to select Decimate. The lower the number on this ratio slider is, the more polygons the hair will decrease by. So essentially, we're trading detail for how efficiently your computer is going to be able to run during the next step of this process. I have a decent computer, so I set mine to 0.5, but if you have a weaker computer, you might want to go even lower to like 0.35 or something. After we've added these modifiers, select this little drop-down symbol, and we're going to select Apply on both the Solidify and Decimate modifiers. I want to remind you again to please save your work at this point because we're moving on to the last step in Blender, which just so happens to be the most intensive on your computer. For the last step, we're going to want to head into Edit mode, go to Select, and select Sharp Edges. At the bottom left of Blender, a box will come up where you can pick an angle of sharpness, and we want to set that somewhere between 20 and 25. With those sharp edges selected, we want to navigate to the item window on the right side of Blender, head over to Mean Crease, and change that to 1. This is going to uphold the shape of the sharp objects on our item while we smooth out the rest of it. Now, navigate back to Object mode. So the last thing we're going to do is select both our hair and character model, navigate back to the blue tool icon, and add the Subdivision Surface modifier to both of these items. Give your computer a few seconds, sometimes minutes, and after it's done, you should get a smoother looking model like this. In my experience, I usually move the levels viewport from 1 to 2. This also takes some processing time, but the end result will be a smoother look. The last thing we want to do in Blender is select both of our items, go to File, Export, and select OBJ. The only thing we're changing on the side is checking this selection only box and making the scale 10. Once you name and export your file, we're about 90% of the way done with this project. We just have some cleanup to do now in Zbrush or Nomad Sculpt. Now when I did this project for the first time, I used Zbrush because it had a 14-day free trial, but then I learned that Zbrush is $40 a month after the fact, so I'm going to be teaching you how to do this with Nomad Sculpt, which is a much more affordable and accessible tool. Nomad Sculpt is a one-time $15 payment that works on most iOS and Android devices. Tools like Nomad Sculpt are most frequently used on tablets like iPads. For example, I used an iPad from like 2019 for this. But since we're not using Nomad Sculpt for anything too intensive, if you don't have an iPad or a similar device, you can probably get away with just using your phone. Although if you want to get into the fine details of the Mini, it might be worth it to pick up a device like the Apple Pen or whatever cheaper alternatives are out there. Now that we're in Nomad Sculpt, the first thing we want to do is import our OBJ file. We can do this by going to the folder icon at the top left of the screen and selecting Open under the import text. Now, locate and select the OBJ file we just exported from Blender. Once our file is imported, we want to navigate to the toolbar at the top right, choose the Selection tool, make sure we're on the lasso, and then we simply want to outline the entire item with our selection. What that's going to do is select all of the meshes that make up our 3D model. We're going to navigate to the 3-dot icon next to the folder icon. This will pull up a list of all of those meshes, and they should all be highlighted to indicate that they're selected. Once we've verified that they're selected, we want to navigate to the Join button at the top of this window. This is going to combine all those meshes into one solid 3D object. Now for our pseudo final step, we want to navigate to the third icon on the top of the window and select the voxel option. We want to move the resolution slider to about 700 to 800. Then select remesh. I mentioned this as the pseudo last step because after remeshing your 3D model, it will become printable. But I do recommend we take care of some imperfections first. We want to make sure there's no big holes in our model. So let's go ahead and orbit around our model by pressing and holding the background to twist it and pinching and pulling to make it zoom in and zoom out. If you don't see any holes in your model, congrats, you did a great job in Blender. You can move on to the next step in this process. But it is easy to miss things. For example, I missed this area underneath my character's left armpit. And that's the result of not thickening something that was too thin in Blender. So how do we fix this? The first way is to go back into Blender and follow the 5-step process to thicken the part underneath that left arm. But it can be extremely tedious to go back to that step in the process and then select your sharp edges again and then subsurface your model again. So there is a way to take care of that in Nomad Sculpt. Step 1 is to navigate to the Layers panel, click the Add button, and add a sphere. Once your sphere has been added, you could use the Gizmo tool to move it around to fill the area that you need to. Make sure to overfill the gap, because we're going to smooth it out to make it look nicer on the model. Once our sphere is filling that hole, deselect from the Gizmo tool and press Validate. Now, we want to use a combination of the drag brush and the smooth brush to mend the broken area. Before we use these brushes, I want to point out the top bar on the leftmost side of the application. We want to uncheck the symmetry icon before we use the smooth brush or any of the other brushes. The slider above the symmetry icon is used for changing the intensity of the brush. For the smooth tool, anywhere above 50% is good. And the slider above that changes the size of the brush. So use that as you see fit. You can use the drag brush to move the sphere into more of an abstract shape that fills the area nicer. And then you can use the smooth brush to blend it into the surrounding area of the model. If you need to create more surface on the sphere, you can use the clay tool to build more volume into the sphere. If you check the subtract icon, you can remove volume. And sometimes you can see me using the planer brush as well, which is like the clay brush, but more flat. Once you've filled the hole with a pretty similar sized shape, you can go into the layer manager and join together the character model and the sphere mesh. Now they'll be considered the same object, so you can work on blending it more seamlessly into your model with the same tools if you'd like to. If you're planning on printing this as a D&D miniature, don't worry so much if it looks ugly. It won't show up on the Mini. Just make sure that hole is filled. With that taken care of, it will be pretty smooth sailing from here. Again, you can print this model as is if you're happy with the way it looks, but let's go ahead and clean up some of the imperfections. Imperfection 1 is you'll notice that some parts of the model have kind of a grainy popcorn ceiling look to them. And for a cleaner look, I recommend smoothing those areas out before you print. Here's the way to do that. Navigate to the tools in the top right of the program and select the Smooth tool. Before we use the smooth tool, I want to point out the top bar on the leftmost side of the application. We want to uncheck the symmetry icon before we use the smooth brush or any of the other brushes. The slider above the symmetry icon is used for changing the intensity of the brush. For the smooth tool, anywhere above 50% is good. And the slider above that changes the size of the brush. So use that as you see fit. Now with the smooth tool selected, we want to draw over these rough areas. You'll see the graininess start to disappear, and that's what we're looking for. With that taken care of, you've got a pretty good miniature ready to go. Since we're printing on a pretty small scale, there's one thing I like to do to ensure we get a good print, and that's just increase the size of the hands. We can do this by selecting the Inflate brush and dragging it across the fingers and the palm of the hand. Once the hand is about twice the thickness it was before, we can use the smooth tool to make things look a little bit cleaner. We can use this same method to make some of the more fine details on the model stand out. I recommend using this tool for things like jewels, beads, rings, and buckles. After that, you successfully have fine-tuned a 3D model from Baldur's Gate to be printable on your 3D printer. In doing all this, you've passed with flying colors, but if you want extra credit, you can actually add even more details if you follow along with this next step. If not, go ahead and skip to the exporting portion of this video. Now, the only thing that this model really lacks at this point is some of the finer details like stitching and indentations in certain fabrics and metals. We can add a reference image to our scene by navigating to the Image tab at the top of the window and importing an image. I noticed that this character has some stitches on their pants, so I wanted to go ahead and add that to the 3D model. I do this by using the brush tool and kind of just replicating what I see on the model. This doesn't have to be perfect because, like the name implies, miniatures are small, so these details are barely going to come through on the small print. But this is something to consider and something that I wanted to include, especially if you're doing it at a larger scale. Or maybe you just want some hyper detailed minis. We can also use the brush tool to make indentations in the model. Just remember to check the subtract icon. Similar to the brush, another helpful tool is the crease brush, which allow us to make extrusions that have more of a pinched look to them. This is really good for extruding extra detail in fabrics. With that extra information and everything you've done, it is time to export the final version of our model. Select the folder icon, navigate to export, make sure OBJ is checked, and then go ahead and press export. Once you've transferred this file from your Nomad Sculpt device to your PC, you can import it into your slicer program. And if you've made it this far and you've 3D printed before, I'm going to assume you know what to do in this application. If not, I'll link to the guides that I use to learn how to 3D print minis in Chitubox. But that is everything. You have successfully taken your character from Baldur's Gate 3 and turned them into a file that is 3D printable. Congrats! I know the road here was a little convoluted, but I hope this video was able to give you, if not direct you, to all the resources you need to make this happen. At this point, if you have any unanswered questions or you're really struggling with one part of the process, leave a comment, and I've probably been in your situation too, and hopefully I can help you find a solution. I feel like this tutorial has been long overdue for the Baldur's Gate community, and while it did take an extraordinary amount of time to unearth the information, learn these 3D programs from the ground up, and then edit a 35-minute video to share with you, I feel like this opens a door for the community, because now we should be able to have people who are more experienced with 3D programs hop on board, share more information with us, and help streamline this process even more. And who knows, maybe this video will catch the attention of Larian Studios as well. I'm no game developer, so I have no idea how difficult this would be, but a feature inside of Baldur's Gate 3 that allows us to press a button and get our characters as a printable STL file to make minis out of is the ultimate dream for something like this. Because right now, it takes a lot of work, and I'm exhausted from it. I'll have links to everything I mentioned in the description, as well as a link to my Ko-Fi page. If you got a lot of value out of this video and you feel like supporting me, you can do that here. And while I have the availability, I also have commissions open right now to do this process for your characters if you're unable to. If that sounds interesting, make sure to check that out before those slots fill up. And thanks again for watching. See you guys in the comment section.